Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
The podcast of Wheaton College. Lewis had a love of classical mythology, and he's, rather than seeing a huge break between the pagans and the Christians, he called paganism the childhood of Christianity. And if you ask what happened to the pagans, he would say they became Christians. In The Discarded Image, he says those who disliked the early Christians would have disliked the pagan writers for the same reasons. So in many ways, he's showing us a kind of sanctified paganism. The girls say they would have been afraid of Silenus and all these revelers if Aslan wasn't. Now, this is one of the things that bothered Tolkien about the Narnia Chronicles, because fauns are known for their sexual appetites. Bacchus and Silenus are drunkenness. So he thought Lewis was reaching too far to try to sanctify these classical illusions and making them somehow a safe part of Christian festivity.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. Today we continue our 7-part series where we discuss the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. And today we are moving on to the second Narnia Chronicle called Prince Caspian.
The Return to Narnia. It has a subtitle.
Oh, it does?
Yeah, it's the only one that has a subtitle.
Oh.
See, listeners, you've learned something already.
But I understand this is not the story that Lewis intended to be the second story in the survey.
That is correct. He finished The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. He said, once I've created the character of Aslan, he drew in the 6 more stories after him. So in his mind, it was the charismatic character of Aslan that sort of became the benchmark or the catalyst for writing several more stories.
So he did plan 7 total.
He didn't until he got toward the end of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Okay.
His friend Roger Lancelin Green said, "You never explained why there's a lamppost in the middle of the northern waste." And Lewis started saying, "I didn't explain that." So he started writing The Magician's Nephew as the sequel. He got bogged down. It has a lot of biographical or autobiographical elements, and I think it was more emotionally difficult for him to deal with that material. So he set aside The Magician's Nephew, which we'll get to in its proper order, and picked up Prince Caspian as the sequel. His original idea was, he talks about it in the middle of the book, when you read a story, someone rubs on the lamp and out comes the genie.
And he said, we'll see in future novels, he was influenced by the Arabian Nights.
He was, yeah, especially that'll come up in Horse and His Boy.
Yeah.
And so he started saying, well, what would it be like for the genie? You're sitting there watching a football game and all of a sudden you get this summons and you have to go to another world and perform a bunch of services for your master. And so he originally was going to call the novel Drawn into Narnia because they were in Britain and suddenly they get Caspian blows Susan's horn and so they're drawn into Narnia. The editor said that was too hard to pronounce. So he tried a horn in Narnia. And they didn't like that, so Prince Caspian was the title. Several of these had alternate titles. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very rarely when you hear an alternate title do you think, oh, that would have been good. A lot of times you're like, a horn in Narnia? No.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, he did that with a number. As we get to the different ones, I'll talk about alternate titles.
Oh, okay, cool. All right.
Even A Horse and His Boy, which I think is a great title.
Oh, yeah.
Was not his first choice. That was about his 3rd or 4th choice.
Okay, all right.
One of the places we went to in England to visit Charles Dickens' sites, he has a piece of paper in this house where he lived where he had about 50 names trying to come up with the title for David Copperfield.
Right.
And you see Copperfull, Dopperfield, Dinkledore, all these. And then he decided on this one, and of course, David Copperfield is a famous.
But they all had the
novel.
same rhythm. He wanted da 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 da.
Yeah.
So he had Pepperfull and Pennyfield, and so it's interesting. And David Copperfield was about halfway down the list. He tried another 20 names before he went back.
I know, it's so interesting, and that reminds me.
Thank you for joining our Dickens podcast.
That brings us back to Prince Caspian, because one of the things that delighted me this time through is Trumpkin's sayings. And I actually wrote down every single one because they were so delightful. But you were talking about the rhythm of David Copperfield.
Right.
And so I looked at all his statements like beards and bedsteads, horns and halibuts, bulbs and bolsters, soup and celery. They all alliterate, of course, but they all have the same rhythm. It's almost always a one-syllable word that comes first. Sometimes it's 2 syllables, and then a 2-syllable or 3-syllable word next. So it's very poetic in its rhythms. And I just thought of Lewis delighting in coming up with these funny phrases. He does it 15 times.
Oh, wow.
Is it always Trumpkin who does that?
It's always Trumpkin. It's only Trumpkin.
Interesting.
And it reminded me of the story we heard from C.S. Lewis's stepson, Douglas Gresham, that when Lewis would get angry, he knew that as a Christian, he didn't want to curse. But one time, Gresham heard him just yell, curse word, curse word, curse word. And it seems to me he's providing these statements of exasperation, of frustration, and delight, which would often be curse words in our culture, by being poetic, by creating something new. And that whole idea of creativity fulfills the Imago Dei. I just loved that this time going through.
Well, you mentioned Dickens. There's actually a Dickens character in Little Dorrit who does this. He throws out these kind of nonsensical combinations. And so that's actually a kind of literary. In fact, in Little Dorrit, one of the characters' expressions is prunes and prisms. And the name of the queen in Prince Caspian is Pruniprissimus. So it's a Latinization of this phrase from Dickens.
This is Dickens' allusions.
Yeah, it was those are,
Wow.
Okay, did we just discover something right here and there?
Well, Aaron, you're talking about what do you need to say about Prince Caspian other than reading it? But see, we're here to tell you. There's a lot of details.
Well, speaking of
deceptively
words,
simple.
I should let our listeners know that Crystal has some notes over there that look like she's discovered the Rosetta Stone or something. It's very detailed notes. I was going to ask you guys, since we're maybe talking about the language that Lewis uses in this book, which in some places was very poetic and very wonderful, and then other places I felt like I ran into a brick wall of like awkwardness. One of them was he kept using the word bivouac for their camp. And the first time it was kind of, interesting, but then he kept coming back to it. And so there was this phrase he said, so this is Lucy and she's going out and she's going to have this sort of experience. I don't think this is when she encounters Aslan, but it's the time before that. It says, she was looking straight up at the Narnia moon, which is larger than ours, and at the starry sky, for the place where they had bivouacked was comparatively open. It's like, what? So it just pulled me out, and there were a couple moments like that in the book, and I just kept going, stop using bivouac.
But that was probably a term that was very familiar to early 1950s British audiences. I mean, they were still recuperating from World War II, and we have to remember that as he's writing this.
Yeah, I think so. I think World War II, this would have been a common phrase. Does he ever say broomsteads and bivouacs? Does Trump ever say that? Yeah, I think that's a fairly common term for that era.
Okay, all right.
He does throw in some vocabulary words. When I wrote my book on Narnia, I told the editors I wanted to add a glossary of words that readers may not know. And they said, oh, this is children's literature. You don't need a glossary. And then when they saw the list, they said, we need a glossary.
Yeah.
Because in Prince Caspian, we have hauberks, which is a suit of armor.
Yeah.
And we have the days up in front of the room, which is the heightened platform for the VIPs.
Yeah.
And one of them mentions a portcullis, the big grate that comes down in front of a castle.
Yeah.
So you need a glossary for some of Lewis's stories.
Yeah. And some of those seemed understandable because there's, it's a very specific thing you're describing, but it's like sledge last week threw me off. And then I go, oh, well, that's how they refer to them in England. But I thought bivouac, well, they have the word camp there. It's not like it was that foreign, but anyways.
Oh, that's the kind of thing that Tolkien would avoid. He would always choose the simple Anglo-Saxon word.
Right.
I bet you don't find bivouac anywhere in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a challenge to our listeners.
Yeah.
Well, as long as we're talking about the vocabulary Lewis invented, there's also characters, and I love that Dickens allusion, David. That's so exciting. But even the teacher of Caspian, Cornelius, is quite clearly an allusion to Cornelius Agrippa, who was a famous
Christian
mystic,
alchemist and
and
astrologer.
that's the type of person that Lewis wants his mentor of Caspian to be. Someone who still believes in supernatural realities, whereas the Telmarines have totally given up on the supernatural, clearly.
Well, he mentioned when he first went to Oxford, before he was even a Christian, Lewis went to the Bodleian Library and he found this edition of Cornelius Agrippa from the 14th century.
Whoa.
And he wrote in a letter, I have held his book right in my hand. So he had a fascination with Cornelius Agrippa, which, once again, that name, I'm sure that's an allusion to that
Interesting.
Christian alchemist and astrologer.
So this was before he became a Christian, you're saying?
Yeah.
So he was intrigued, but this goes back to the power of joy in his life, his awareness that there's got to be something more than just the empirical hard realities of everyday life.
Yeah.
And did you notice this time, as we all read through it again, that he gives a quote unquote a stab of joy to a character that isn't even named in the text. So that when Aslan comes back, there's a little girl who is sitting in a classroom. So once again, we talked about that in our last podcast, that school was so oppressive for C.S. Lewis. So he has a little girl looking out of the window while at school and then seeing these trees moving, and she had a stab of joy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I want to get back to that, but David, I want to ask you a question, and then I think we probably should turn the heater back on because it's going to get too cold, and I'll just filter the heater out. I should let our listeners know it's like -3 or something outside.
We can almost see our breaths here.
So, David, tell us a little bit about Lewis's inspiration for the story. I feel like this is a very common story type where you have a usurper king and a young child, and the child has to escape and go gather allies in the wilderness and come in and take back the kingdom. It kind of reminded me almost of King David a little bit from the Bible, but I know that it's a story that's also been told in fiction a bunch of times. So where did Lewis get this inspiration for Prince Caspian? Why this story, and why does this come second?
Well, I think his composing process was often very spontaneous. He didn't sit down and outline a whole story. So his first premise was, what would it feel like to be the genie who gets drawn away from your world to some other world? And they are, when the horn blows, they're all drawn to Narnia.
Yeah.
And they're just sitting in a railway station, minding their own business, and all of a sudden they start feeling these prickles and what's happening?
Yeah.
Now, once he got there, he and Tolkien were both fascinated by the idea of other worlds with other time frames. And you see that in Lord of the Rings when they go to Lothlorien and they come back and Sam says, well, wait a minute, the moon, we weren't there a whole month. The moon is off. And they explain that time runs differently in Lothlorien than it does in the rest of Middle-earth.
Yeah.
Lewis had the same fascination. Even in Miracles, he says God could have created alternate realities which have different time frames.
Yeah.
And we talked about that hideous strength. Merlin lives in a parachronic state, which means a parallel time frame. And then he wakes up and comes back and joins the people in the 1940s.
Well, and then you have the Dark Tower story that was never published, but is really definitely playing around with sort of different universes and different times and things like that.
And both Lewis and Tolkien liked the time machine, that liked the idea of a machine.
Oh, by H.G. Wells.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they spend a lot of time trying to figure out, it takes them a long time to figure out that they're at Cair Paravel, but hundreds of years have passed. They don't recognize the place because everything's broken down.
I figured that out before them, and I'm
I know.
like, okay, get there, people.
Yeah, we did too. Yeah, most readers go, I think it's Cair Paravel. I should mention that Lewis loved a place on the north coast of Ireland called Dunluce Castle, which is a castle ruin right on the waterfront, or right on the cliffs overlooking the water. And I think his description of Cair Paravel, we see it again in that silver chair. It's very similar to Dunluce Castle. Crystal and I have been there.
Oh, wow.
And you really feel like, I feel so much like Prince Caspian. I just landed in this beautiful castle ruin. Although we didn't find any gold chess pieces.
I was going to say, you didn't find the treasure room.
Yeah, didn't find the treasury. So it started out with the idea of being drawn, and then there was the long period of we're in a different time frame. Hundreds of years have passed.
Can I insert something there about the time frame? When I read this statement that Edmund says, once you're out of Narnia, you have no idea how Narnian time is going. why shouldn't hundreds of years have gone past in Narnia? Which reinforces what you're talking about. But it's also, it reminded me of Einstein's theory of relativity, which was 1905. And he said 2 events simultaneous for one observer may not be simultaneous for another if the observers are in relative motion. So they have different motions in their different worlds.
Right.
But what I love about Einstein's theory of relativity is that he establishes there is a constant. And the constant is light.
Speed of light.
Yeah.
And Lewis establishes the light of salvation, Aslan, as the constant. And Aslan doesn't change while all the other people, while Narnia and Telmarine people are changing.
Well, there's also a practical purpose because he drew a time frame of Earth time versus Narnian time.
Oh, he did?
He did, yeah. He drew a chart in his own mind to keep him straight.
Yeah.
In his mind, creation happened about 1900, and the last battle, they're called out after a train accident about 1949. Now, it just so happens that's almost the exact time frame of Lewis's birth in 1898 until he wrote the Narnia Chronicles. So he's able to compress all of Narnian history from creation to the apocalypse in the time frame of basically his lifetime.
Wow.
So it's a clever device on his part because they don't have to literally time travel. They can just drop in for creation, then they come in for the redemptive moment of the New Testament. He said this novel is about a period of apostasy. Someone asked him if all 7 chronicles hung together. I read a letter in our interview with Michael Ward talking about Lewis's own scheme for the 7.
Oh, yeah.
And he did say, this is creation. This is the redemptive moment in the New Testament. He called this novel to be about a period of apostasy. The old beliefs have gone stale and other people have come in. Clearly, there's a whole spectrum of belief among the characters.
Yeah, I want to talk about that when we get to some of the more the characters, specifically Trumpkin in the story.
And Knickerbock.
Yeah. Okay, so then the question is, where does he get the story for Caspian and the young king cast out and the usurper? Why that story?
I think you're right. That's a fairly common plot device. I believe there's a long backstory or a long flashback when Trumpkin has to tell them everything that's been happening in Narnia.
Yeah.
And some people don't like that narrative structure. They feel like it's more awkward than Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe or some of the other stories.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you an exact source for that.
Okay.
I could tell you, I think the Telmarines, we find out, means earth sailor. Tellus is earth and marine is a sailor. I think he's playing around with all the legendary material that grew up around the mutiny on the Bounty. Fletcher Christian and others sent Captain Bligh in a rowboat, and then they disappeared off the map. This is like 1789 was the original mutiny, and they didn't find out where they'd gone until 1810. So there was all these legends of what happened to these mutineers. They landed on Pitcairn Island and started a little colony there.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of mystery about that mutiny and what happened to the mutineers.
Yeah.
And I think the whole idea that they went through a door to Narnia is he's playing around with, here's my explanation of what happened to these
Well, because at the end,
sailors.
when we learn about Caspian's, spoiler alert, when we learn about Caspian's heritage and that he's actually a son of Adam and a daughter of Eve, we learn that there's like this whole pirates and they apparently killed the natives and then, interbred with some women. And apparently there was some cave on this island and they
that's another portal
through the cave to Narnia. And so they're not actually Telmarines or something like that. So sounds like he's just combining a bunch of different things from.
Yeah.
Which he tends to do. He tends to be very synergistic.
Right.
There's that line you mentioned when he says you're a son of Adam and Eve. Does anybody have the page on the book of Adam and Eve?
I wrote that down, David, about the shame and the honor of Adam and Eve. He says, honor enough to go erect the head of the poorest beggar, and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor.
Yeah, so I thought that was a wonderful idea because in many ways, that's the glory and shame of being a human being.
Yeah.
That we once were unfallen creations in God's image, but after the fall, we've all been seriously twisted and deformed in our original natures.
Well, and what's fascinating is in the very next line, Prince Caspian bows to Aslan when he says that.
That's right.
And so it's Lewis's way of saying he's going to be one of the greatest emperors. He's very clearly setting up Caspian as this good and just king. It felt very much like King David to me in the story as I was reading it this last time.
Right. Well, there is a lot of adventure stories, as you say. It's very common. You have a problem of a legacy when someone dies, who's going to inherit the throne? And all through English history and other European history, you have uncles who are grown men who say, why does the king get to be the eldest son?
Yeah.
So that whole intrigue of you've got to get out of here because now they had their own son, that's a very typical story you find in a lot of adventure stories. Some of this, I think, comes from Sir Walter Scott, the whole idea of the single combat. He loved Sir Walter Scott's novels, and he had a lot of scenes of this kind of thing, the mortal combat between the champions. We saw that in That Hideous Strength, where O'Rule becomes the champion for her country.
Yeah.
So once again,
that's Till We Have Faces.
I'm sorry, not That Hideous Strength. Yeah, Till We Have Faces. But anyway, he liked that idea of single combat, and once again, he loved to describe the actual strokes and the moves. But that's the kind of thing we now expect to see in movies. But when Lewis was growing up, that's the kind of thing you read about in adventure stories.
Well, he does do a good job of. There are a number of times when I was reading this story, and I thought this would make a good movie. I think there's some places where they maybe didn't hit the nail on the head with that movie that did come out, but his description, I thought Lewis does a good job of. You could turn this into a screenplay. Some of the things that are happening, like the battles and the way he describes small little details, which are good and help you to kind of visualize what's going on. And then there's other places where he describes things, and like we were talking about before the podcast, and I think I don't really care about what they're eating. The first quarter of the novel, he spends a lot of time talking about what Peter and Edmund and Lucy and Susan are going to eat and them focusing on their next meal. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, just move on with the story. We don't care about the sandwiches in their pocket or whatever.
But and all the apples, all they could eat when they first arrived were apples, more apples. They were getting sick of apples.
Yeah.
Right. Well, if you've ever had bear meat spiced with apple juice, I think you'd appreciate that scene more.
Going back to your question about the origin of Prince Caspian, I even wonder if there's something going on about the Caspian Sea that Lewis might be thinking about. It's the largest landlocked sea in the world, and it's filled with islands.
Well, he liked looking at maps. And remember, when we were talking about Till We Have Faces, in the early version of the Psyche myth, she had a twin brother named Caspian. So that name was in his mind. If you look at maps, there was a town called Narnia in Roman maps, up in the mountains above Rome. There's a town called Narnia. It's now called Narni. It's still there.
Huh.
It doesn't lead you anywhere, though, outside of Italy.
I was going to say, I feel like that is a tourism misstep to rename their town Narnia.
I know.
I think they do have some plaques and things.
You have to come to the Wade to
find
go
the portal to Narnia.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Bardia is this town in North Africa that was much fought over in World War II. So he would have been familiar with, that's the warrior in Till We Have Faces.
Yeah.
And Pevensey is a little town where William the Conqueror landed when he first came to England. That's where his landing spot was before the Battle of Hastings. So I have a feeling that he got some of these names like Caspian. He enjoyed looking at maps, but he liked the sounds of words. I'm not sure how much you should push for thematic content.
Right.
One critic says they're called the Pevensies because in William the Conqueror first landed at Pevensey before the Battle of Hastings. But about 10 years before I wrote Narnia, somebody said, I'm struggling to come up with a surname for my character. Do you have any thoughts? And Lewis wrote Pevensey. I've always liked the phrase Pevensey. So a lot of times he just liked the sounds of things.
Oh, and so he just kind of picked them up along the way.
Right.
That makes sense. And then they find their way in his stories in one way or another.
Right.
And that's so true. We have to be careful not to allegorize things where people just want to impose meanings that add nothing to the text.
Yeah.
And our general rule of thumb, if you heard it on this podcast, it's authentic. But if you see it somewhere else, be skeptical.
If David
could
says
be reading too much
it's
into
gospel.
Right. Right.
Well, you mentioned about the letter that Lewis wrote about the different
Right.
themes in the novels, and the one in Prince Caspian is apostasy. So I want to ask you about that. There are a number of characters in the story, and they all seem to reflect different stages of faith. Even the children themselves, Peter and Edmund, Lucy and Susan, go through different stages. So what was Lewis trying to do there? And I guess maybe we could talk about some of the characters. So I feel like Trumpkin is Lewis's appointed skeptic. In this novel, I feel like he has to have a skeptic in every novel that he does. Even when we were talking Until We Have Faces, it's the fox, but he always has to insert that skeptic character into the story. And there's almost always two skeptics. There's one that is sort of refuses to obey or refuses to go along and is evil, and then there's the good skeptic who doesn't believe but is willing to go along or to follow Aslan even though he can't see him. And he kind of shows a kind of journey of two skeptics, like which way they could go in the story.
Right.
And I feel like Trumpkin is the positive skeptic in this story.
And Nickabrick, the negative.
Nickabrick is the negative.
Yeah. So they first encounter these three characters. Truffle Hunter, who still totally believes in the deep magic, and the other extreme, Nickabrick. And you're exactly right. The Trumpkin, who is halfway in between. And I love that element because it shows that Lewis is endorsing honest skepticism.
Yeah.
Right.
Versus,
it's like Kirkpatrick and that his strength.
Yeah.
Versus Nickabrick, who is not only skeptical, but then at one point he says, I'll believe in anyone or anything that'll batter these cursed barbarians to pieces. And that's the type of person who has decided in advance what he thinks is right or wrong, and he'll believe anything that supports his ideology. And that is entirely irresponsible. And you can see that, and it happens to people on both the extreme right and the extreme left. So I run into people who have decided in advance that miracles are not possible, that the supernatural isn't possible, and therefore they just will not even open themselves to reading the Bible because they've decided in advance that miracles don't work.
Right.
If the evidence is there, it must have been falsified or it's not real.
And that's the way Nickabrick is. But he's also like the opposite extreme who says, well, just give me whatever will support my cause. I'll believe anything, he says.
You see that in the climactic moment when King Peter meets Caspian and they kill those three creatures, the hag and the werewolf. And there was a statement in there that I wrote down that I just really stood out to me. Lewis, I feel like Lewis, we don't give him enough credit. I think he really does understand evil and does a very good job of portraying it in his novels. But he writes, we want power. I think this is Nickabrick saying this. We want power, and we want a power that will be on our side.
Exactly.
I feel like there's a common denominator. I feel like as I've been rereading the Chronicles of Narnia, and then as we talked about the Ransom trilogy recently in Lewis's novels, where whenever evil is afoot or something is, somebody's being tempted to doing something wrong, there's quarreling, accusations, mean and hurtful words are lobbed at each other, and there's violence or threats of violence, and it descends into chaos. And sometimes it'll happen really fast before people even realize what's happening. And so you see that at kind of key moments in Lewis's stories where evil intrudes into the world, and all of a sudden people are saying mean and hurtful things. And then you see it when characters are choosing to do good or to be around her. So there's that moment where Lucy is mad at Susan, and they're marching along and they're following Aslan, and Lucy's biting her lip to not say mean things. It says, but she forgot them when she fixed her eyes on Aslan. And so he draws that distinction throughout the novel between good and evil. And it's how he illustrates that through Trumpkin and Nickabrick and that skeptic thing in the story as well.
Yeah, he has these interesting triads. We have talked about that scene with Susan, but she's always the most spiritually perceptive, Lucy.
Yeah.
And Susan is always the most pragmatic and the most skeptical. Yeah. And the scene where she sees Aslan, this is Lucy, sorry. They're trying to find their way to Aslan's How. Now that's a real word. How is like a hollowed out tomb place.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, they have a famous museum in England called Sutton's Hoo. It's spelled differently.
Oh.
They found this huge Anglo-Saxon ship and king's mask and all these wonderful artifacts.
Oh, wow.
So a how is a real thing. It's a burial mound.
Oh, okay.
Often hollowed out where the artifacts
I was going to say,
are.
I had a lot of questions about that. When I read the story a long time ago for the first time, I thought, how is the stone table underground? What is the
Right.
world? What in the world is going on?
Right. And this is
Right.
obviously hundreds or thousands of years after the events
Yeah.
when the children were there. So the stone table has now become an artifact underground. I was going to mention, in many ways, Narnia represents the world of enchantment, but it also represents the world of Lewis's childhood. A lot of their slang is from Lewis's childhood. When they say he's a real brick,
Really?
that means he's a real good person. He's we would
Real
say
solid.
Yeah, we
We'd
would
say he's a solid character.
Yeah, but it's also the world of the supernatural.
Yeah.
And so you have Truffle Hunter says, we hang on. Badgers are known for when they bite, you cannot get them to let go. They have very powerful jaws. And so he takes that as an image of loyalty. He used to call his brother Warnie Badger. That was his nickname for his brother Warnie. And it's associated obviously with loyalty. Trumpkin is kind of the enlightened skeptic who definitely wants to serve the king, Caspian, but he's not sure about supernaturalism. And then Nickabrick is the pragmatist. Gibbon said in Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire that the masses found all myths equally true, the intellectuals found them all equally false, and the administrators, the government officials, found them equally useful. And in some ways, Nickabrick is that kind of a pragmatist.
Right. I love the fact that Nickabrick is probably the closest thing to an evil character in this reading. And part of the reason we don't like him is he doesn't smoke and he doesn't dance.
That's right.
Which are the exact opposite of how I grew up, that, a good Christian does not smoke or dance or go with boys that do.
He's a fundamentalist Nietzschean. That's a bad that's a bad combination.
Combo.
Definitely.
Back to the scene with the children, but it's the same continuum of spiritual sensitivity. Lucy sees Aslan first and says he's telling us to go up the gorge, not down the gorge. And I love the scene where they have to take a vote, and Trumpkin is practical, Susan is practical. But then Edmund says, well, the last time this happened, I pretended not to believe.
Yeah.
And so he's later on called Edmund the Just, but in this scene, he's almost like Edmund the Trusting. I love this. And then he's the second one who sees the lion, and then Peter, and then Susan. And once again, I think that's a metaphor of your openness to spiritual realities.
Yeah.
If you believe in them, you are likely to start seeing them.
And it's not even just that Edmund, that he's open to it. I think he wants to, because there are a couple moments where he's like, oh, is that his shadow? And like he really wants to see Aslan, which is why I think he gets there second. I feel like Edmund really gets redeemed in this story in a big way. Is the way that he trusts Lucy, and the way he doesn't argue with his brother, and he's willing to follow his orders and everything. And I mean, he really, I think, stands out in this novel. He and Lucy, I think.
Lewis had a very high view of sanctification. Edmund in this novel, and then we see him again in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. We're going to meet Eustace.
Yeah.
But he really felt like faith can turn bad people into good people.
Yeah.
You can have a lot of very negative traits, but through this pilgrimage, this spiritual journey, you can end up being a very different person than you started out.
I love this construct where Lucy sees Aslan and others can't see him. And it's a great imaginative fulfillment of the famous statement by Anselm, credo et intelligam, I believe in order to understand. And so what Lewis is showing is that believing is seeing versus skepticism. The skeptic, like a Trumpkin, says seeing is believing. No, I haven't seen miracles. I haven't seen all this. How could I possibly believe it? And that is exactly the struggle that Lewis experienced as a Christian at the height of modernism, where modernists were saying, no, seeing, I won't believe something unless I can see it, unless I have empirical proof. But many times you have to believe something first and then you see it. But even Lucy, who we are supposed to respect for that because her belief is so strong that she actually sees Aslan, who is there, even at one point, rather than just making her a one-dimensional character who is always the seeing things correctly and right
Mhm.
and does everything right, Aslan has to exhort her that she's being a little self-righteous, that she sees and the other
Yeah, well, and there's also
kids
there's
don't.
also that moment where she's having this conversation with Aslan, and he doesn't say this, but she figures it out on her own that she was supposed to follow him the first time.
Right.
And
right.
her worry is, well, if I follow you and they don't follow you, then that's not good. So and it definitely feels like Lewis is trying to make some sort of spiritual metaphor here about following and the importance of following and its
Yes.
relationship to believing. And so it's almost like following leads to believing, which leads to seeing, because you see that with Trumpkin. The one redeemable characteristic about him, even though he's a skeptic, is that he's willing to follow High King Peter. And so even when they take the vote, he says, well, if High King Peter says we're going to go this way, then I'll go that way. It's not about what I want. It's about, who I'm following. And by choosing to follow him, he eventually gets there to belief. And so that moment where Lucy's like, well, what if, am I supposed to follow you even if nobody else follows you? And that was a really meaningful moment, I think, of the story.
I sang in the last episode, there's an old Sunday school thing. I've decided to follow Jesus, no turning back. Should I be singing that now in this podcast?
No, but it definitely
I did
feels
have
like
a
that's
request for
relevant.
more singing from me. It is relevant, and it's also, that whole passage, this is the classic example of why the Narnia Chronicles are so deceptively simple. Lucy hears her voice being called in the night, which is supposed to remind you of Samuel in Samuel 3, 1 Samuel 3. And she says to Aslan, you're so much bigger than when I last saw you.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, no, I'm not bigger. Your capacity to see me is bigger.
Right. The constant is the light. Aslan is the light. Perception is relative.
That line, he says, every year you grow, you will find me bigger. And I thought, oh my gosh, that was so relevant to me, even as an adult.
Right.
Yes.
Well, Lewis said in the letter that our spirit is a lens, and the more you can clean the lens and gain power, if you are looking at the stars through a telescope that's cracked or smudged, you're going to have all kinds of misconceptions about what you're looking at. You're going to think you see all sorts of features on the moon that aren't there. Yeah. And in many ways, her spirit is a lens, and that she is able to see how much bigger he is with her further experience. That comes up in at least a half a dozen mystics. My book, Into the Region of Awe, I quote Augustine, Catherine of Siena, Ignatius Loyola. They're always saying it's really about our capacity to experience God more fully. It kind of goes back to St. Paul's prayer that I wish for you that you could understand the depth and height
and breadth. And the verse, for now we see in a glass darkly, but then face to face.
Right. So I'm going to invoke MacDonald here. I think MacDonald would say that our communion with God increases to the extent that we realize that we need him. And I think when you're younger, you don't quite, the problems in your life are not that big. They feel huge. And then when you get to be a teenager, they feel even bigger. But then when you become an adult, as you sort of experience more about the world, you realize less and less how much control you have over things, and the problems in the world feel like they get greater and greater. And so it's almost like your capacity, your need for what only God can provide grows. And so in that sense, there's something that he can supply that you realize it can only come from him. And if you are at least responding rightly in faith, you would then keep turning to him. And so he would get bigger in the sense that your needs are getting bigger and he has more that he can provide.
Right. Well, there's something else going on with that scene where she says, well, they wouldn't come with me. And of course, I couldn't come follow you on my own. And he says, well, yeah, you could follow me. One of Lewis's, he wrote a whole book on Paradise Lost. One of his favorite poems was Milton's Paradise Lost. And Milton wrote that right after the Puritan experiment in running England failed, the Commonwealth. He wrote it in 1660. And one of his motifs, he felt like I'm one of the last of the true Puritans who still loves that worldview and that view of the church, which he considered to be much more pure than the Anglican view or the Catholic view. And he has a motif in Paradise Lost. Milton has a motif of the one lone faithful. There's an angel named Abdiel, and this entire legion that is following Lucifer, and they're going to rebel against God. And Abdiel says, no, I'm not going to do that. And so he starts walking away from the legions of Satan, and they're all taunting him and jeering and saying he's a coward. And when he arrives at heaven, there's 10 times as many angels who welcome him and praise him. And Michael, the archangel, says, when we go to war with Satan, I want you to strike the first blow.
Wow.
In a later scene, when they confront the armies of Satan, Abdiel goes to the fore and he takes out a sword and knocks Satan to the ground. And so this image of the one lone faithful was very attractive to Lewis.
Huh.
And I believe that's in the background when she says, I could never follow you by myself. They wouldn't come along. He says, yeah, you could have followed by yourself.
Yeah.
I believe there's a little bit of Milton echo in that scene.
Well, I felt like there was a number of parallels there with Perelandra, because he has a line in here where they were talking about the redemption and how everything's happened. And I don't know if it's Aslan I think it may be Aslan. He says, things never happen the same way twice.
Right.
And I feel like he says that same line or something similar to that in Perelandra, but in the sense of like, what if Perelandra had fallen? What if the queen had given in and had sinned? And there's that moment where Tor says, well, I don't know what would have happened, but I wouldn't have necessarily fallen too, which is totally different than how it happened on Earth, because Adam was just like, oh yeah, I'll eat the fruit as well. And so there's that sort of implication that Tor would have stood alone in that moment.
Right.
But then the idea is redemption would have looked differently. Jesus wouldn't have come to Venus and died on a cross. It would have been, instead of a three-dimensional thing, it would have been a cube or something, whatever is the line that he says.
Right. And he liked that idea. You can't ask what would have happened. He liked the verse in Scripture where someone says, is it true that John is not going to die? And Christ says, what is that to you? You don't need to know what John's career is going to be. And Lewis quoted that in his letters. And often in the Narnia Chronicles, she asks what would have happened. And he says, you're not allowed to ask that question.
Yeah, he says, no, nobody has ever told that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask a question, David, about the end of the book. So at the end of the book, they're having this moment and the battle's happening, and we kind of skip over to Aslan and the girls. And what is going on with Aslan and the girls and the revelers? And then Bacchus shows up, and there's a old fat man on a donkey, and they're eating grapes. And I'm like, what in the world is going on?
Right.
What is going on with that? Oh, and what are they yelling? Yuan, oi, 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 or whatever.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Oi, oi.
That is a Greek cry of celebration. Uan is a name for Bacchus.
Yeah.
It's Dionysus in the Greek, and it's Bacchus in the Roman.
Well, I knew the oi, oi, oi. I know that was Greek, and I figured Yuan was a name, but yeah.
Yeah, that's his name. And then the oi oi is a cry of merriment.
Yeah.
It's like hurrah, or whatever you would say. God save the king. That's not quite the same thing. I think it shows
Dorothy Sayers addressed C.S. Lewis in letters going, oi, oi.
That's right.
O-I,
yeah.
the exact same word.
Yeah. Lewis had a love of classical mythology, and he's, rather than seeing a huge break between the pagans and the Christians, he called paganism the childhood of Christianity. And if you ask what happened to the pagans, he would say they became Christians. In the discarded image, he says those who dislike the early Christians would have disliked the pagan writers for the same reasons. So in many ways, he's showing us a kind of sanctified paganism.
Oh.
The girls say they would have been afraid of Silenus and all these revelers if Aslan wasn't there.
Yeah, something Bacchus and his girls or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, this is one of the things that bothered Tolkien about the Narnia Chronicles, because fauns are known for their sexual appetites. Bacchus and Silenus are drunkenness and merriment and orgiastic things. So he thought Lewis was reaching too far to try to sanctify these classical illusions and making them somehow a safe part of Christian festivity or Christian. Lewis liked anything he liked, he tended to try to Christianize it. So he would take the dying God myth, and obviously that was important to his Christian faith, classical mythology, things that he found in other writers. He was very clever about finding ways to bring them into the big tent of his Christian worldview.
Interesting. So, okay, so yeah, then there's games that they play, Blind Man's Bluff and Hunt the Slipper. What are these games that he played as a child? What?
Yeah, those are real English games, kind of country games. And he has a lot of emphasis on dancing. He loves the metaphor of the dance.
Yeah, everybody's dancing.
There's
but I
individual
cannot
wills, but they're all coordinated.
imagine C.S. Lewis dancing. But he over and over and over emphasizes it. The dancing in the skies, the dancing of the trees, the dancing of the animals.
We're going to see it again
of the people. Why do you think he liked it so much?
He loved the image of the great dance. He didn't like dancing. He wrote in Surprised by Joy, people would invite me to a dance. He says, why did you do that? I never invited you to a dance. He said the English are very awkward when it came to those kinds of celebrations. He also, when he became a professor, he literally had to kneel, and the senior professor put a sword on either one of his shoulders and said, "I wish you joy." And Lewis said, "It was the most awkward moment of my life." He said English don't have a flair for festivity or graceful celebration, but he did love the literary idea. And it goes back to the medieval idea of the great dance, is that all the planets and all the stars have their own course, but they're all interwoven in this beautiful orchestrated movements. So he loved the idea of the dance as an image of individual free will, but under God's sovereignty, all the free wills interweave in a very pleasing and graceful way.
Well, it's interesting you mention that, because Lewis does talk about this dance. He mentions it, I think, obliquely in Letters to Malcolm. But in there, he also talks about the universe, everything being delegation all the way down, so that God doesn't. There are things that God could just do unilaterally, but He has other people do, and that's a thing that happens a lot in this story. And so I think in my head, I'm thinking, why is Bacchus there? Why is Silenus there? I mean, Aslan could do all this stuff. They don't need to be there. And then there's the moment where at the end where Reepicheep gets brought up by the most woebegone mice that anybody's ever seen, and they're plastered in mud and blood.
Oh, yeah.
And Reepicheep is all wounded and his tail is cut off. And rather than Aslan just say like breathing on him, Aslan has Lucy come up and use her sort of magic vial to heal him, except for the tail. And so that was an interesting thing that stood out to me as I was reading the novel again this time, is where Lewis has all of these characters do things. Even the same thing with King Peter. He's like, well, I don't know when Aslan's going to show up, but I know that he wants us to go out and fight. And so even if I have to go out and fight this guy and die, or even if it's just stalling until Aslan shows up, they each feel like they need to do their part in the story rather than Aslan doing everything.
Well, once again, that is Lewis reflecting this fundamental Christian truth that we are called to community. You said Aslan didn't need all those people. Well, Jesus didn't need his disciples who were basically tripping him up all the time. But he was modeling that people see him through his followers. And that actually has an incident in the text. It says, Lucy had her eyes on the lion, and the rest had their eyes on Lucy.
Yeah. Oh,
so
that's a great image.
This is what we are as followers of Christ. The word Christian means little Christ, of course. And people have their eyes on us, but what we desire is that by looking at us, they will see Jesus.
Yeah. So one last question, and then maybe we can wrap up. We've talked about Lewis and Romanticism, and we have a whole episode. And it feels like that's a very strong theme in the story here. Once again, you have the Telmarines. We know that they're evil because they're afraid of trees and they don't like nature, and
they've hunted animals,
and they're scared of animals. And so that's that was a very it sort of stood out to me. And so maybe we can talk about that. But also, I wanted to talk about that romance related to trees. So there's a lot about waking up the trees in this story, and the trees come and sort of help out in the battle. And it feels very much like he's copying Tolkien and the Ents, but I don't know if that was, is he copying Tolkien, or is this something that they both loved and had talked about? What's going on there?
Well, a lot of that, once again, is classical mythology. Okay. The dryads and the hamadryads and the naiads. Yeah. So they're personifying nature. We talked earlier about the ancients tended to see anima or spirit or mana in nature. I mean,
Owen Barfield has lots to say about that.
Exactly. A lot of this comes from his friend Owen Barfield, that first the external world became demystified and it just became mechanical devices. Basically, everything organic is just a kind of biological machine. Yeah. And then eventually, not only our exterior world becomes demystified, but our demythologized, but our internal world. We no longer are subjectivity. One scientist said we are machines made of meat, or we're computers made of meat, which is a very dehumanizing
just
metaphor for humans.
Signals.
Right. Yeah. So his idea, I think both of them have the idea that when the world becomes demythologized or demystified or disenchanted, that all those spirits fall asleep and you don't see that anymore. And eventually that becomes internalized, and we ourselves see ourselves as just a kind of mechanism, a thinking piece of meat.
Gotcha. So he's not copying Tolkien with the trees, or what was the timeline there?
Tolkien, well, they both knew classical mythology. Tolkien said he got the idea of living trees from George MacDonald's Phantastes, The Maid of the Altars, and the Gentle Beech Tree.
And Lewis may have as well, since Phantastes is what baptized his imagination.
Well, there's a new book by Holly Ordway on Tolkien's sources. And when Tolkien's thinking about Treebeard and the other Ents, he says, I wonder if I should present them as being Hanau, H-N-A-U. And he's borrowing that term from Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet.
Yeah.
So there's not a one-directional influence here. They both know classical mythology of the Dryads and the Hamadryads. They both know George MacDonald and the Living Trees and Phantastes.
Gotcha.
But in some ways, as Tolkien's developing Treebeard and the Ents, he's thinking about some things he's read in Lewis. Are these rational souls? And then I do think when Lewis has the whole woods attack the Telmarines, that's very much like the Ents attacking
Last March of the Ents.
Orthanc.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that Tolkien must be there. Tolkien wasn't that happy about Lewis. He felt sometimes he plagiarized in both the Space Trilogy and Narnia. He didn't give that example, but I could see how he might think, well, he heard me read Lord of the Rings, and now he's got trees attacking people.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting question to explore.
Okay. I also felt when I was reading the story, I kept thinking to myself, like, I don't know that Lewis makes a very good geologist or biologist because trees don't eat soil. And there's that moment where they're eating soil. And if trees ate soil, you'd have giant holes around all of your trees. Their food comes from the sunlight and carbon dioxide that they take in. So their meals would technically be very different. And then the whole river and the gorge and in 1,000 years, a river cuts that gorge. And of course, he invokes, he's like, well, maybe there were some earthquakes and landslides in there and that sort of a thing. So
You're starting to sound like Eustace in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. You always have a scientific explanation. Be careful.
Well, it was just one of those things in the story where Lewis felt like he kind of would throw in some sciencey stuff around it. And it's kind of like the spaceship in Out of the Silent Planet. And you kind of go like, you don't need to try and explain gravity because it's not right the way you're explaining it. It's just pulling me out of the story, So Lewis does good when he stays in that realm of imagination and tries not to give naturalistic explanations for things, I feel like.
Yeah, that's true. Well, his brother used to make fun of him for not keeping up on current events or on biology. He thought a slug was a kind of reptile.
Oh, no.
And one time they were talking about Tito, and Lewis referred to him as the king of Greece. He didn't realize he was the dictator of Yugoslavia. So, yeah, when it came to a lot of practical knowledge, that wasn't Lewis's strong point. I'd have to agree, yeah.
So what did you guys take away from Prince Caspian when you reread it this last time? I know you've read it before, but what sort of stood out to you?
Well, we've talked about all this wonderful theology and how it is communicated imaginatively. It reinforces, as you already said, how much nature was a powerful influence on C.S. Lewis's imagination. Yeah. Even, we just talked about the trees. I was fascinated by the multiple references to ivy growing over things. So it actually grows up over this bridge. And so it's like bridge is this human restraint over the ford, and the ivy comes and just knocks it down. And that is such a romantic idea. Yeah. It's like Shelley's famous poem Ozymandias, where humans create a big statue and then all that is left is nature. Yeah. Nothing beside remains. I mean, it's a powerful poem.
That's true. That whole ending scene where the bridge gets destroyed by the ivy and the little boys turn into pigs, and a lot of that comes out of Ovid's Metamorphosis. We talked about Metamorphosis in when we talked about Till We Have Faces, the golden ass. But the whole idea of metamorphosis is things are transforming. It's very dreamlike, that closing scene where the school pops open and there's the woman.
And Aslan.
Which was the nurse.
Yeah, and Aslan.
Yeah, it turns out to be the nurse.
Aslan goes into the house to heal the old lady and grows big enough, and then the house kind of like falls away. And Yeah,
there's also some New Testament stuff. He turns the water into wine very quickly.
Yes.
So suddenly this world of enchantment, which has been suppressed for centuries, is breaking out. We're seeing miracles and transformations and celebrations. Yeah, it's a very dreamlike scene. As I say, if you read Ovid's Metamorphosis, once again, he's almost Christianizing that idea of transformation and all these wonderful things changing.
And it's about community, once again. Even once the talking animals are agreeing to go for a feast or have something to eat in order to plan their battle, they can't even agree on how you should approach it and what you should eat.
I love the bears.
They're suggesting,
Bears are like, we got to make sure we don't miss dinner, and then we'll have to rest after dinner.
Right.
And who's going to be the marshal of the list?
That's what I love, even though you go, well, what does it matter what they eat? I think that Lewis was trying to get at followers of Aslan, like followers of Christ, don't always agree about things. They approach things differently. They see the truth differently, which is reinforced by the fact that Jesus, when he healed blind men in the gospel accounts, he heals them differently. They come to the light. The light doesn't change, but how people see the light differs.
Things never happen the same way twice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that is what we really need to take away from this, because there often develops a sense people feel like, well, to be an authentic Christian, you have to think exactly the same way that my church approaches the truth.
Oh, yeah.
And that Lewis, like the Bible, endorses plural perspectives.
Well, and
on the same truth. The truth doesn't change, but our perspectives on the truth change because we see in a glass darkly.
Yeah. And you see that with his depictions of leadership throughout the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yes.
Even Caspian, when they're having, the council, and then even Peter, they're consistently asking other people what they think. And then they take everybody's idea and then they try and come up with what they think is the best idea that will work for everyone.
Collaboration.
As opposed to a decision needs to be made and we're just going to turn, David, what do you think? And only what the leader says is what we're going to do, and not, instead the leaders typically come into those situations and say, well, I'm pretty sure I don't have all the right answers. What do you think? And they all sort of pool their ideas and then they come up with something that works for everybody. And
I remember one of my crises in college is having been told growing up when I asked about this speaking in tongues that the Bible talks about. And the answer I got is, oh, well, Satan uses tongues to deceive people.
Oh.
And then I go off to a Christian college and I'm told the exact opposite, where people tell me, well, unless you speak in tongues, you don't have the Holy Spirit. So I went from this one extreme to the other, and it's that either or mindset that only if you do it the way that we perceive the truth do you really see it. And that is just the exact attitude that Lewis is undermining through this novel.
I also like the scene at the end where the Telmarines are going back through the doorway to their world, and they're all afraid, and the one guy steps forward and volunteers to go, and Aslan breathes on him, he blesses him and says that you'll have magic and you'll get rewarded in the new world. And so that idea of stepping forward and being willing to obey even when nobody else is, to me, kind of
stepping out in faith
comes through in the novel. And you see that also, I feel like, in Prince Caspian, because he gets all of this just sort of thrust on him, realizing that, he's actually the true king, and then he gets woken up and by Cornelius, and you've got to leave at once, and he gets thrust into everything, and he just steps into it. And that was, to me, that theme of faith and following Aslan was a powerful theme in the novel as I was reading this last time.
And when Aslan asks Caspian, do you feel fit to be king? And he says, no, I really don't. He says, well, that's good. That's the right answer.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You always need to be careful, as David and I discovered, when someone really wants to be the chair of a department.
Right.
That means that they have an agenda they want to impose on someone else. So you always want to choose as a chair someone who really doesn't want it.
Right. Another example of community is when Reba Cheap's tale gets cut off. We haven't talked much about Reepicheep, but he's
Oh, I
actually,
know, but we're
many
gonna
people,
see
he's
him
one of their
more.
Yeah.
He's
favorite
so-
characters. Yeah.
Oh, he's so
When his
great.
tail gets cut off and he's so chagrined and he says, my dignity and my honor are destroyed. And Aslan really wants him to live with it until the other mice say, well, we're going to cut our tails off too because we don't want to have something that our leader doesn't have. And so Aslan says, I'm going to heal your tail, not for your dignity, but because of the love
Yeah.
you have with
That was a really
your-
sweet moment.
Yeah, that was a very
Right.
sweet moment.
And in fact, earlier in the podcast, Aaron, you said something that it reminds you of King David.
Uh-huh.
This was the moment where I thought of King David because I had just read in my devotional reading yesterday about that incident where David is at war and he just tells his warriors, oh boy, I am thirsty.
Oh,
So
yeah.
these three
that was
great
great.
warriors go sneak through Philistine lines, go to a city, surreptitiously get water for David and bring it back to him. And David can't believe the sacrifice they made. And so he just pours it out to God. And I was kind of thinking, what were the warriors going, hey, we got it for you, David. But there was just what is profound about that Bible passage is that David was honoring their incredible sacrifice for him. And that is what the little mice were doing for Reepicheep.
Right.
We will
Right.
cut off our tails if you don't have a tail. I mean, it's just so glorious how Lewis takes these profundities and moves them into a delightful little story that can entertain on one level, but the more you know about Scripture, the more you know about the history of Christianity, the more you know about philosophy, the more profundity you see.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's also a line that where that they're walking through the woods and that big gray bear comes to attack them and Trumpkin kills it
Right.
with an arrow. And they're all distraught because they've killed this wild animal. And they're wondering, well, maybe he was a talking bear or he used to be and he had gone wild or something. And there's that line where one of the girls says it to the other girl. And I thought, did Lewis invent the zombie genre where he says something about like, what if humans turned into animals and we had to treat them like wild beasts? And I thought, oh my gosh, that's so relevant both for the zombie genre, but it also made me think of
Well, he mentions werewolves in
yeah,
the text.
but it also made me think of sort of the way in which when humanity goes wrong, we treat creation and the animals like that, as if it's a thing to be tamed and to be killed and to be beaten back. And you definitely, I feel like that's a big theme in Narnia, and that Lewis is trying to set up is that a God honoring life and existence realizes that we're here to be responsible to take care of these creatures, and that maybe we need to ford a river rather than build a bridge, even if it means we have to get our feet wet, because what will it do to creation? What's the cost?
Right. That we are part of creation.
And his villains, they don't respect the sanctity of life, either in trees, vegetable life, or animal life, or human life.
Yeah.
In some ways, the sanctity of life is a package deal, and you should respect it. He and Tolkien both.
Yeah.
In terms of takeaways, I wanted to go back. We mentioned it already, but I love the scene with Lucy at night being called by Aslan.
Oh, yeah.
And my takeaway is sometimes Aslan is calling you particularly while others are sleeping. And when you meet him, he gets larger and larger as your spirit enlarges your capacity to experience him. And then finally, he may be asking you to go it alone. You can't really wait until everybody else is on board. I just love the personal takeaway of that whole scene with Lucy and Aslan in the night.
Well, and the way that Lewis depicts their conversation and that's the thing that happens in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as well, is where people come to Aslan and they'll say something and then they have this moment of self-realization and Aslan's just looking at them. He doesn't say anything and they're like, well, but what if this? But what if this? Or what? And Aslan just kind of stares at them and the conviction that it brings on them. And it reminded me of the way oftentimes it feels like when you're praying, where you kind of know what God is saying to you, but you kind of let you go through all these excuses before you finally kind of give in and assent to what you know he's trying to tell you.
I think you're exactly right. He says in letters that often when we're speaking to God in prayer, he's speaking to us in prayer. And he said it's easier to pray for other people because you don't have to do anything. If you say, help that person to get a better attitude, but if you say, help me to be more empathetic to it, then there's obedience involved.
Yeah.
And he said he always preferred to pray for other people because it was up to them to respond to the prayer. So I think you're exactly right. He felt that he has this in almost all of his books, a moment of clarity where either Melel-Dil or Aslan just kind of stares at you and waits for you to figure out on your own what self-understanding or self-insight needs to happen at that moment.
As your voluble self chatters on.
Exactly.
Definitely.
That's a good place to stop, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Because our voluble selves have
I
chattered on enough.
know. Well, thank you guys for letting me join you in the very cold basement on this very cold day.
My toes
I hope all of you who are listening are able to find some warm place to listen to the podcast. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks as we discuss what novel next?
Next is going to be Voyage of the Dawn Treader.
Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Okay. All right. I like that story a lot.
Yeah.
All right. See you guys then.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.